As I mentioned in the previous session, that there were three main aspects to the study. One was to study about financing, which came before building the houses. The second was implementing the projects, building the houses. And the third was finding out how well these houses were, how well they performed, and how happy people were living in them. When financing was looked at, it was divided into two main types of financing by organizations. But I should also mention that some households who had not benefited from agency help were also studied to give a kind of comparative aspect to the research. So there were three main types of housing which were studied, funding which was studied. Firstly, loans, and some organizations provided loans to households to build their houses. That is the first type. The second type were grants, outright grants. Houses were built for people without the free houses were given out. And the third was self-financing, when people managed to find their own money and then build housing for their own. And the basic thing which was found was that, there was one program which was studied in great detail. It's called the Grameen Bank, and it is quite well known. It's been internationally acclaimed because of this innovative way of giving loans. And not to get into too much detail about it, but just to say that this organization provides loans at a moderately high rate of interest to very, very poor people. And people use this money to build houses for themselves, and then they repay the loan back over a period of 10, 15 years. It's just like any other mortgage. But saying that, this bank is a very specific type of bank. It tried to help people who had no access to formal banking institutions. And so it has been very, very widely acclaimed, and they have won awards and so on. But now, when this study actually looked at some of the projects, it was found that many of these loans weren't going to very, very poor people, partly because they couldn't pay the money back. And one particular case was studied where it was seen that this household took a loan, and they were doing fine, and suddenly they were struck by problems. There was bad weather, and they couldn't have good agricultural yields, and they started, defaulting on their loan. And once they started defaulting, they developed a very, very poor relationship with the bank, and the bank had to threat them and want to seize their house or the building materials that were given. So this led to a very, very unhappy situation. It has been said that the Grameen Bank, for example, has a 98% rate of recovery. Now, just to say that 98% sounds very, very high, but what about 2%? The Grameen Bank actually built 300,000 houses. So out of 300,000 houses, if you take 2%, it's a very, very significant amount of money which is not coming in, and a significant amount of people who cannot pay it back. So there are these problems. Even with the grants, a similar problem was seen that, houses were given to people, but very often it was the relatively better off households who could manage to get grant housing. There was never enough to give housing to everybody, really, except for very, very few cases and few examples. In one project, it was seen that houses were given to everybody in the village, but that was very unusual. So that was the basic finding of financing, that the very poor were excluded from such provision or such intervention. Secondly, there was the second aspect which was studied was implementation and the different types of ways of building housing. And the two main types, one was when the agency went and built things, which is the agency-built form of intervention. The second type was self-built, and that was not the form of agency intervention. As in the case of financing, some houses were studied who built housing on their own without the help of agencies, just to compare and see how effective agency intervention was in comparison to self-built housing. And when agency-built housing was studied, it was seen that there was very often corruption in the projects. The contractors who built the housing stole money, and people got very, very poor quality of housing and problems like that. Now, when the self-built housing was studied, it was seen that it was very advantageous for houses because they could control the process of building. But there was also, it was seen that there was a decline of what is known as traditional ethics of doing things. People were, even within self-built situations, people were trying to deceive each other. And there was this permeation of the cash economy. People were much more interested in earning money than they were before. So there's this whole change in transition within the self-built mode also. And the assessment of implementation was essentially done or structured according to the level that the household participated in implementing houses, even agency-built housing. If there were some projects when the agency did something, some parts of the project, and then some of the other things are done by the houses themselves, and it was seen that the more involved the household was, there was less corruption. So there was this whole link between household participation and corruption. And the third aspect, which was about housing design, is again, to refer to what I said before, is to see how well these houses or the settlements perform. When settlements were looked at, there were two types of settlements were looked at, again, dividing it up into agency-built or agency-planned settlements and self-built or self-organized settlements. And in the agency-planned settlements, it was found that there was a basic awareness of design issues. Many of these settlements were planned by professionals who weren't design professionals. They were engineers or even bank officials who were just laying out, designing buildings. And they were, for example, one settlement was seen where all the toilets were kept on the outside of the settlement. And so there was hardly any privacy in this kind of traditional setup. Women need much more privacy than in other situations. Women were not using those toilets, and they presented a very unpleasant view to the outside world. So this is the kind of, planning that was seen very often. In the self-organized sites, on the other hand, in contrast, they were very, very well designed. They met local needs, and they could actually respond to the necessities of the particular household or community. But the main problem with self-organized settlements was that they lacked infrastructure and sanitation. Very often, they lacked tenure. Many communities actually settled on land which they could not live on very long, and they managed to build very, very excellent settlements only to be evicted after a few years. Now, when construction or building materials were looked at, it was seen that many of these agencies were interested in promoting and utilizing more durable types of building materials, unlike the kind of traditional, organic, less durable type of building materials that local communities generally use. Many of these used innovative or non-traditional building materials or building techniques. And some of these had become popular. And there's one example where reinforced concrete posts were used instead of bamboo posts. Bamboo posts are more typical and common, but they decay and they get spoiled more quickly. So agencies came along and they tried to promote this idea of building reinforced concrete posts, RC posts, if I may use that. And this became very, very popular. After the agency started applying these, they were taken up by the local community, and many informal sector building materials producers started producing RC posts, and they became very popular. But of course, RC posts are much more expensive than bamboo posts, perhaps up to 5 to 6 times more expensive, and they were not affordable by very, very poor households. So that problem remained. Corrugated iron sheet is another example, very, very popular, and households always wanted to build with CI sheet. They aspired for such a material. It had an additional status attached to it. If one had a CI sheet house, it was considered better. So that was but there were other materials, and they ran into major contextual problems, other innovative materials, and they were not accepted. For example, stabilized earth blocks, that's another idea, that blocks made out of local mud and using a little bit of cement to make them stronger were applied. But they never caught on, and local communities did not accept them to other ways of doing things. Or there was another example, which is the microconcrete roofing tile, which were roofing tiles made out of cement, and which actually could be built locally, but even then most people did not like them. There's one example of a project which was built in an area with a lot of coconut trees in that area, and coconuts used to fall on these tiles and break them, unlike other types of roofing. So local people didn't like them and didn't want them. In some places, the agencies thought that they would build on stilts because of floods, but this was again unacceptable, and local people didn't like these stilted houses, and some of them had actually sawed off these stilts and lowered the houses. Because of cultural reasons. Women didn't like to climb up on those stilts. they didn't find them safe. Sometimes if there would be strong winds, they would find that the houses were shaking and hazardous. So these were some of the problems. Then finally, the study came to a few conclusions, and regarding these three aspects, and some of these conclusions implied certain new strategies or approaches to doing things. Firstly, when financing was considered, it was seen that there has to be some kind of special mechanism for the very, very poor, because they were being excluded. And not that housing loans were bad, essentially, but they could actually be mixed with grants, so that, people could get part grants, part loans, which is known in technical terms, financing policy mix. But also there was this whole potential for tapping into existing household strategies. Households had their own networks and own strategies for getting money. There were local village moneylenders who could actually be supported by agencies. So this was not done by many programs, but there was this, hidden potential. When implementation was, considered, it was seen, as I mentioned earlier, that household participation could actually be used to overcome or to resist corruption. But saying that, there are limits to participation. Not all households want to participate. They might not have the time to participate, or some households were not in a position to participate, such as women-led households who were in a much more vulnerable position. And therefore, this whole idea of participation needs to be very, very seriously thought about, how it could actually be fit into very, very specific situations, and how it could be interpreted according to such situations or contexts. Then there was this whole potential for a formal and informal link in implementation. For example, agencies could actually support local building materials producers or local entrepreneurs to produce certain building materials instead of actually producing things on their own and supplying them. And that could actually prevent the problem of corruption. When housing design was considered, and it was seen that there's a need for a comprehensive approach, which as mentioned, most agencies were not aware of, which is, again, in technical terms, is known as integrated settlement planning, but it basically means involving a very comprehensive idea of providing infrastructure and also building houses, but also long-term sustainability of these settlements. So this was lacking, and there's this need for a very comprehensive approach. Then there's also the possibility of improving upon popular but non-traditional alternatives. And I mentioned the idea of RC posts, which were provided, but they were more expensive. And a research was done later on to find out if RC posts could be improved, and it was suggested that they could be built hollow instead of the solid type that were built, and a reduction of cost resulted in a reduction of about 50% less expensive cost, lighter to transport and easier to build with, and so on. So such improvements can be done. There's possibly no way to revert to previous ways of doing things in completely, but the new materials that are coming in, they could be improved upon and adapted, and especially those materials which have proved to be popular, such as concrete posts or corrugated iron sheet. But what is very, very important, and which has been given very little attention, is the whole idea of regenerating and improving the natural resource base. Much of this bamboo cultivation needs to be improved. There can be ideas such as a bamboo farm, which just produces bamboo as for building materials, and ways of improving bamboo production, improve techniques of propagation, for example, of bamboo, maybe chemical treatment of bamboo to season them better. And so there's this whole area which hasn't been dealt with at all, which agencies can direct their efforts towards and readdress that. And finally, there were some general conclusions of this study, is that, okay, there are new ideas, new technologies, and these have been experimented and worked with in many other parts of the world, but they haven't, the main obstacle, which remains, is disseminating these ideas, how to communicate these ideas, how to make people understand that there are ideas which are outside and which can actually be adapted, and how to disseminate these. So this is one of the main issues, that, okay, the technology is there. There's perhaps no reason to innovate new ways of doing things, but the idea is to give people the benefit of knowledge which is already there. and let people take it on board and adapt it to their own circumstances, modify and change as necessary. And the final thing, which is very, very important and which has started coming up, is the idea of partnership or networking, which is related to the previous idea of dissemination. There can be no dissemination unless there is partnership between different parts of the world. For example, there could be partnerships which are international in nature, national in nature, or even local, between different groups who are doing different things, who can share ideas among themselves and build up different forms of solidarity groups which can actually help low-income communities overcome their predicament.